Good evening and welcome to the Tuesday, March 21st, 2023 study session of the Olympia City Council. For the record, we have a quorum with Mayor Pro Tem Gilman excused. We have one business item that's on our plan tonight, and that is to receive a briefing on our comprehensive emergency management plan. It's been a few years since we've had you in front of us, the fire department here that runs those programs to brief us. And we've got several new council members since that time. So it's a real good opportunity for us all to get on the same page as far as what happens when we get that phone call from our city manager. It's my pleasure to introduce Interim Chief of the Fire Department, Todd Carson, who is joined by Deputy Interim Chief Mike Buchanan today. And so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Mayor Selby and council members. We really want to thank you for the opportunity to present this comprehensive emergency management plan. It is a large body of work, and we're very proud of the final product where we've landed with this. And I also wanted to acknowledge our interim deputy chief, Mike Buchanan. This is a lot of work. Among the other duties as assigned, as you all know, we have a lot of things going on. So I just want to express my gratitude to Chief Buchanan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Chief. Madam Mayor, City Council, City Leadership, thanks for this opportunity. We're going to discuss the Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan. At any point, if you have questions, please reach out or talk, and we'll have a discussion as we move forward with this. I'm going to go ahead and cover some of the materials that are in front of you. The large binder is the Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan. Right now, that's just there for your reference and thumb through as we do the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I'll be gathering those back, and then we'll be reissuing them and swapping them out for the previous version that's still maybe around. So just let you know that. So right now, it's just a chance for you to kind of view it, but you'll be going back out into the system after this is over. The other thing that you can see is Olympia City Council Disaster Plan Quick Reference Book. That has been updated to today. And if in the event that there's an emergency, you could refer to that, and it kind of walks you through what you might expect next. So months from now, if something were to happen, that's just something for you to take home. So with that, I can go ahead and get started. Okay. So here's our agenda this evening. We're going to discuss the emergency management program in its entirety, kind of briefly. And then we're going to go ahead and review the comprehensive plan, and then talk about managing emergencies and how that's done in the city of Olympia. And then towards the end, we'll go to the current state of our emergency management program. And at any time, and at the very end, can answer any questions you may have. So let's talk a little bit about emergency management. It is a division of the fire department per Olympia Municipal Code. Under the city manager, the fire chief serves as the director of emergency management, and then assigns that emergency management coordination to the interim deputy chief, which is me right now. We'll talk more about the emergency management coordinator position as we move forward, but currently I'm holding that role down. The purpose of emergency management is to plan, prepare, and respond to and recover from the effects of disaster, high level. So it's the work that we're doing now, all the way through recovery in the event when we have a emergency. Some functions of emergency management is to provide the resources and skills and supplement response efforts from an overwhelming event. One of the important things about emergency management is documentation, and you're going to hear me say it a few times. Documentation equals money, and that's emergency management plays an important role in that. But another important role of emergency management is gathering information and analyzing that information and making real-time decisions that does the most good for the most people, bringing infrastructure back up, protecting lives and property, and getting the city moving forward again. Another thing about emergency management is we really focus on supporting the crews that are in the field, managing whatever the infrastructure problem might be, fires, police work. But at the Emergency Management Center, we're not directing those resources from the field like a command and control general would in the military. But instead, we're supporting those processes through the side to give them the tools that they need to do that work. So we're not commanding field units from that Emergency Operations Center. We coordinate activities across multiple departments, which is very important, and sharing information real time and finding out what we need to do to support what's going on in the field. And then we share information all the way up to the mayor, and then out to the public to make sure it's one message. So that's emergency management in a nutshell. Let's talk a little bit about the history of emergency management. In the 1980s, that was kind of a new discipline, and the fire department recognized a need to develop that. And so Chief Ridgway and Chief Rambo at the time in the 1980s came together, one from Olympia and one from Tumwater, and formed the first emergency management program. They hired a consultant to write a report and basically an emergency management plan, and that was first adopted in 1982. In 1995, we got our first CEMP, which is what we are reviewing today, which is our comprehensive emergency management plan. And since 1995, every 5 years, we've updated that. And so this cycle is, one of the updates. Why is it an off year? We had a year extension due to COVID. So we got another year out of that last plan, but the new one's been adopted in 2022, just the very end of the year. So 5 years from now, we'll be doing it again. So I want to give credit to Patrick Knopf. Patrick Knopf was the author of this plan. He puts a year's worth of work that he worked into in updating this. And since this time that plan has been written, he has been promoted or moved over to Public Works as a project coordinator. And I just had the final task of putting a bow on this and working it through council. And here we are today. So I really want to recognize and honor the work that Patrick did. So where is our program now? So Patrick Knopf served as the first full-time employee as emergency management coordinator. Previously, it was an assistant chief originally that managed this program along with the EMS program in the City of Olympia Fire Department. And then since the department has continued to grow, Chief Wright recognized the need to put a full-time employee in that position. And for several years, I think it was about 3 years, Patrick filled that role and did a great job. With the work that him and Chief Wright did, they really got the program up to running very smooth, robust, considered to be a model in the county, especially for a municipal program. And then did a lot of collaboration and work with the county and the state level EMS or EM work. So they did a nice job. The decision was made probably to, a lot of reasons. We had a fire chief that left, we had some interim positions, and we have an RFA in the future. So the city made the decision to hold off replacing that EM coordinator position and give that work back to the deputy chief. So that's currently the role that I'm in. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So I want to give a little bit of context here. Patrick left in 2021 and during COVID. So COVID, the emergency management position, did a good job giving briefing updates with COVID, interpreting the health information, watching stats in the county. He did that work. And then as he left, Chief Carson to my right was promoted to deputy chief, and he took that work for about 7 months. But he had to get his feet up, up to speed in emergency management. So during that 7 months, it was him learning the vernacular, learning the process. And then lo and behold, he's been made interim fire chief. And so this ball just kicked down to me. And my background didn't have an emergency management background either. But, like we both do, we pay attention and we jump in with both feet, and I've learned a lot. So I'm currently been in this role since August, about 7 months now. And my primary focus has really been, I look at it as maintaining the important components of the program that we have now, one of them being the CEMP. Recognizing that wrapping that up and keeping it current was really important. So that's been a focus. The next thing of focus with the emergency management plan will be the hazard mitigation plan that the county is working on, really looking at the hazards that we have and the impacts of those hazards being disruptive, and making a plan to strengthen our infrastructure and our planning to be ready for those hazards. So I'm part of a work group in that. And then an important piece that you will need to be aware of is the City of Olympia has an annex to that plan. Since that Thurston County plan is kind of an umbrella for the entire county, we do an annex for our portion of how we address those hazards in-house. So they give us a template in there, and then we'll be working to update that. But we're going to discuss it later, that having that hazard mitigation plan is important to receiving grant funds to strengthen infrastructure in the city. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but currently we have one federal grant that's been approved for about $1.1 million. And then they realized that our hazard mitigation plan was out of date, not due to our fault, but the county's work. And we did a special exemption to be reconsidered. And it looks favorable, but we have to complete our work so they can resubmit that to get that infrastructure grant. And that'll come up a little bit later, but that's how important this work is. And then maintaining this work means documentation equals money. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Yes, Jay.
I think I just wanted to add just on the, there's kind of where we are now and where do we go on our staffing for emergency management, because it's such an important function for all of the things that we do here at the city to have a really robust, and I want us to remain robust in terms of our emergency management program, emergency management planning. So a lot of it really hinges on kind of post RFA, right? So if once the RFA vote happens, if RFA passes, the fire department, its resources go to its own entity. We likely will need to then hire our own full-time emergency manager and then likely contract back in some way, shape, or form with the regional fire authority to provide us some resources. So that's kind of one path. If RFA does not pass, then I've got to move forward to hire a fire chief, and then that'll set in motion a lot of other positions that are in interim right now. And then I'll have a discussion about what that looks like, whether that's a function that's going to remain with the deputy chief, or do we need to hire an emergency management position to come back in and take the role that Patrick used to have. So that's kind of what that'll look like moving forward. So I just wanted to fill in those blanks in case anybody had a question.
Thanks, Jay. Some of the regional work that I am doing in this current role is just staying current with the Thurston County Emergency Management Council, being actively involved in that. As I mentioned, the Thurston County Hazard Mitigation Work Group, Thurston County Disaster Assistance Council, the Thurston Mason County is of a local emergency management communication council, just to name a few, but there's actually quite a few meetings that go with that. And then being present for that and helping out with some of the exercise planning and work is important too. Some outstanding needs that are just going to brush really over kind of quickly, and we'll go into more detail when we do a SWOT analysis, is that we have not had an established monthly or quarterly EM meeting in some time. When you look back at COVID and how that just was so difficult to meet and come together during that time, we really haven't seen that since. And then you take the last 14 months or so and the new people in these positions and just trying to keep things, you know, the important things on life support doing well. That is definitely a need. So I just wanted to bring that up. Before I move forward to the next slide, I would just like to ask if there are any questions.
I've got one, Mike, really quick.
Yeah.
So how does the work that we do here in the city layer in with what the county does? They do those tabletop exercises like once or twice a year.
Yeah.
So how does that all fit together?
Well, it depends on the size of the exercise, but we should be interacting between that. So if it's a tabletop exercise, I might be there present with some other people, and we may work through issues and solving problems and how that communication process works, and then do an after action review. But there's sometimes where we do full scale exercises, and it's been prior to COVID, where we will have a large incident that's simulated, and then we would bring up our EOC. We would look forward to Camp Murray at the state EOC, and we would get an incident number, and then we would take that number, and then we would then assemble our EOC, and then we would work through prompts that are needed to address. And then mostly it's a lot of logistical supply chain stuff and communication and developing an incident action plan and doing briefings. And really you just run the cycle of what is the name for that, for a cycle, a planning cycle of work. And then at the end of that, you come back together and you hot wash it. So those are examples that we've done before. Cascadia Rising was, I think, our last large one. And then you can focus, sometimes they'll do recovery efforts, which are very large again, and that's a whole nother element to emergency management. But it's how do you kind of come back after the disaster is over, but everything is still a mess in an infrastructure way. So there's a lot of focuses on this, but did I answer your question well enough?
Yes, thank you. I had anybody else? Because I had one more. You mentioned hazard mitigation. I don't know if it's on a future slide, digging into that a little bit more. But are you, I don't want to.
No, I think now would be a good time, Mayor.
Okay, sure. So hazard mitigation, that seems kind of vague. So I know we do that. We think about mitigation around climate change and all that. So what would be an example of what you could mitigate against a disaster?
Okay, so first I'm going to go back to the mitigation plan. They hired a company called Tetra Tech which is a consultant company that works for Thurston County Planning Commission. This consultant put together a work group, and then from there, they assessed the hazards in Thurston County: flooding, wildfire, earthquake, landslides, things like that. And then they looked at the impact of that hazard using GIS data and see what city would be what would be our primary hazards. And for us, it's flooding, wildfire, earthquake, and then some political unrest and infrastructure, IT stuff. And then what they do is they assign values to that, and then you basically rate your hazards to what your number ones are, and then you take plans to try to strengthen those. Sometimes it's infrastructure, like increasing seismic structure for water lines. It could be training to strengthen the emergency management system and things that we're doing like right now. And it could be climate mitigation stuff, which would be like the work that Pamela Branf's doing, steps that way. It could be looking at the effects of heat and how that's changing and of having effects on populations in Olympia. And then do you have plans for having cooling centers and things like that in place? And then also coordinating that between cities, just so that a lot of times growth happens when you could say, this is how we address this problem, and you look across the fence to see how someone else is doing it, the county or Lacey, and make your plan better. So.
You mentioned IT as far as information technology, so like cybercrime.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and maybe Rich can jump in here on this one, but a good example probably is the flooding as an example. So knowing that flooding is something that's significant for us, we've spent a lot of time in water resources mapping out a lot of the hot spots and places that we see significant flooding. And we've done a lot of work over the years to mitigate that. And so I could think of intersections that 10 years ago would have been underwater at certain times of the year for significant, like 100-year rain event, that now are not. And so, Rich, I don't know if you want to add to that, but I think that's a really good example of hazard mitigation.
Yeah, I'll just add to that the work we've done around sea level rise, which is a flooding risk for our community too, looking out over the next 100 years and the investments we're going to need to make. Mike was talking about the Thurston County Hazard Mitigation Plan and the annex that we need to do to that, incorporating in the elements around sea level rise and the investments we'll need to make downtown is really important for us to be able to be eligible for FEMA funding for resilience. And right now we're not. And so we're in the process of doing some work to get that updated so we can be eligible for the next round of funding coming up this fall. So this is really vital work for us.
Thank you, Rich. Okay, I'll move forward through the Comprehensive Emergency Management Plan. We call that the CMP. The mission of the CMP is to define the policies and procedures necessary for the preservation of lives, protection of property, and the execution of special measures needed to ensure effective and timely relief from a disaster. The plan is designed to guide city government before, during, and after a disaster. The plan describes the comprehensive program that defines who, what, when, where, and how to mitigate, prepare for, and respond to and recover from the effects of natural, technological, and human-caused hazards. The function of the CMP is to serve as a basic plan addressing all types of emergencies and disasters from an all hazards perspective, meaning that rather than developing a separate plan for each threat or hazard, the focus is placed on addressing potential impacts of any given threat or hazard. So for an example, an earthquake could have many different problems that develop from that. Could be disruption of water supply, could be broken gas lines and fires that result, it could be transportation corridors that are down. The point is you don't really know how bad this damage is going to be. And so you're not going to make a plan just to deal with that one thing. Instead, you're going to make a plan that focuses on managing a system of people and processes that can then attack each problem individually within a larger framework that will connect to the regional, state, and federal, which in our case is the incident command system. But we use one specific type, which is called the National Incident Management System, which puts everybody in alignment. So that's really what this is about taking a complex problem, making a plan that does the best with the amount of resources you have, and then coordinating and working together and documenting that so that you can move forward ultimately with the help of your neighbors and up higher above. So I did ask how often is a CEMP updated, and it is 5 years. I'd like to do a quick overview of some of the highlights of this last revision, just to kind of give you context. It'll be brief, and then answer any questions you may have. The updated version is in alignment with the federal comprehensive emergency management guide, which is important. It also is in alignment with the states and the counties. As we developed the plan, and I want to give Patrick the credit, is that when he developed that plan, at the very end, I took it and I submitted it into the state to have it reviewed. And while they don't just approve it, but they do review it and they provide comments back. And the comments were so favorable. They were like, this is a very good plan, very well thought out, meets our needs. And, it was like in the 90th percentile, like in this big checkbox, that a lot of green. And if you like getting badges and out of persons, we got those. So that was kind of nice. So another thing that he worked on was kind of tried to remove some of the EM jargon. There's something called ESF, emergency support function. And you always think, well, what is that? ESF 4. ESF 4 is fire department. And I'm always like, I don't know what that is. So what he did is he took the work and placed it within the department that's appropriate. So fire, rescue, EMS work, that's under fire instead of ESF 4. So he broke that down by each department, and that was a nice addition. And then he did a bold new graphics. That's always comes up when you buy a new car or something, a motorcycle. Bold new graphics. You got a new book, new cover, and it looks nice. So that's a brief overview of it. That I could keep moving forward if that's no questions. So emergency management equals federal money. EMPG, which stands for a, what is that? EMPG, I know this, but it is a grant, emergency management performance grant. The P is performance. It basically, it's one grant that helped fund Patrick's position when he was in the position of an EM coordinator. And it is about $33,000 a year. So that money is ready to be brought in when we want to bring that spot up. So it pays for, maybe a quarter of that salary. So that's nice. It's there. Another example of some of the money that we received recently is the Percival Creek disaster declaration. Some damage to an infrastructure and a bridge in the area of Percival Creek, equal to be about $1 million. So the work that was done under Patrick's time helped secure that. And then we discussed the hazard mitigation grant. It's called Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. It's the McAllister transmission main of about $1.1 million. That's what we are hoping to secure once we finalize this important work. So I'd like to discuss kind of how we manage emergencies here in the city. And we're going to begin with the day-to-day emergencies, the ones that really don't touch emergency management, but I'll just briefly cover those. The police every day respond to calls to intervene with property destruction, robbery, or assault, things like that. That's an emergency, absolutely. But the police have the staff training, procedures, and protocols in place to address those things on one-off issues that really don't end up touching the council, other than you become aware of it and you help guide it from a high-level policy. But these things are happening all the day. The emergency management program doesn't get involved with those day-to-day activities. The fire department's the same thing. We go to fires, medical calls, entrapments, rescues day-to-day, but again, that doesn't really rise up to the level. When public works too, I want to recognize the work they do. Storm response, road clearing, water main breaks, downtown flooding. That's their day-to-day emergencies too. Sometimes more than day-to-day, they're flooding downtown. But there are a point when you need to bring up the emergency management EOC. Really, you need to do that once you're overwhelmed with your day-to-day emergencies, and it's going to be a prolonged event. So I want to give you the example of the tidal flooding that we had in December. That event was over in an hour and a half. By the time we would have stood up the EOC, the event would have been over. So you kind of have to say, yeah, that was impactful, and it was sharp and kind of the curve of the bill. But the thing is it was over quickly. So that was one that was kind of on the edge. If this would have lasted 6 hours, we would have stood it up. But we kind of did something called a partial stand-up where I'm aware of it. And from that, I briefed the fire chief. I get a briefing from Rich Hoy. I reach out to communications to ensure that we get one message going out, coordinate what I can do from the back channels, but it's kind of a limited activation. It isn't bringing 13 people into the building and doing some of the things that I'll be showing you next in the future slides. So day-to-day emergencies. But when you have to manage large or complex emergencies that can be long lasting, that's really when your EOC shines, or your emergency management division shines. And I want to kind of talk about that. Your emergency management department is here all the time doing the back work that has to happen to keep the program going. But when you activate, that's when we call the EOC. It's the Emergency Operations Center. And it's basically placing this program in motion to support people that are in the field. I mentioned that one important reason to bring up the EOC is documentation, because in the end, you're going to have good documentation to get the federal money. Who makes the call to open the EOC? And really, we all have influence. Everybody in this room has influence to ask that question, but it really lies with the city manager and the fire chief. And then from there, the EOC is open. And I want to talk a little bit about how we bring people into the EOC. When the decision has been made that the crews in the field are overwhelmed, we need to coordinate cross-discipline between departments. It's going to be a prolonged event and the decision's been made. At this point, I can go to the computer and do an alert through our alerting system. It'll send out a text, it'll send out a phone call, it'll send out an email, and everybody in here will learn that that's happened. At that point, the emergency management committee, who's been identified before this event, will come to station one. And then from there, we will have an EOC manager, it's probably be me at that point. I'm in and around, and we will begin to stand up the ICS system. We'll begin to gather information and then share that information with city leadership, and then make an incident action plan to best support that. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of how you would see that roll forward. One thing I did do is I updated this book for you. So again, in the end, when you go back, it's something for you to take with you. It kind of, if you were to say, what's an emergency, you'll flip right to it, and your role as counsel, make sure your family's safe, come into work when you can, do those things. So with that, I'll move to the next slide. Make sure I'm in the right spot.
Dante.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mike. I just have a question in regards to the location of our EOC. I know where the state's EOC is, but where is ours?
And it's at headquarters fire station downstairs, and it would start, we would probably start off in the classroom at this point. So that's exactly where it is. In the event that station one is not a good place due to the infrastructure being damaged, it would be one of our other stations, one of our 3 other stations, and we would inform you through that alert notification process about where to go. The thing about city leadership for council, what would likely happen is Jay or one of the assistant city managers would probably gather you and then begin to share information, while the work in the EOC happened probably in another room. So that's that work could continue, but you would be briefed, and then you would be able to start helping in the way that you can from your position.
In case the RFA plan does go through, where would the EOC be hosted? Would it still be with the RFA, or would it be the city?
Yeah, we'd have a choice point to make. I mean, more than likely, we would likely contract with the RFA and stand up an EOC in one of those locations. But we'd have a choice. We could actually take some time and stand up an EOC here. Outside of the EOC manager role, which the fire department plays a huge role in, all these other positions that Mike's going to talk to you about, they're city staff that are outside the fire department. All those operations, plannings, logistics, finance, council liaison, PIOs, they're city employees outside the fire department. So really the common thing that brings us together is the EOC manager in that structure. So we may be able to, I could also see a scenario where our contract with the RFA is for support, but we may very well, through our own emergency manager, stand up our own EOC here. It could be in City Hall in a certain space. It could be at the maintenance center. I think we have a lot of options to consider when the time comes.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the incident command system, kind of some nuts and bolts of that. And then I have a picture of a wire diagram that'll help put some clarity to that. But the command staff is the EOC manager in the case that potentially could be me or the fire chief. And then under that command staff is a PIO communications person. You probably would expect that to probably be filled by Carrie. And then a council liaison would probably be one of the assistant city managers. So that would then be your connected point. Okay, it'd be Debbie. Exactly. Okay, thank you. And then I'm going to talk about the general staff positions, which is operations. Basically, the doer is getting the things that done that need to be done. Planning is people that are thinking and looking ahead. Logistics is getting things, the items or the people or the resources, could be something. And then finance is the payers. And I just like linking those simple words to it, kind of gives clarity. So when I saw that, I definitely wanted to put that on the slide. So keeping that in mind, this is what the ICS chart would look like in a wire diagram at a very basic level.
Sure.
I just want to add, and Mike, can you go back a slide?
Of course.
So when Mike talks about the command staff, and in a perfect world, emergency is going to happen, and Mike's going to be there before anyone else is there, or the Chief Carson, and they're going to assume the role as EOC manager. The way it really works in real time is the alert goes out. The first one of them, of anybody on that list that shows up on scene, becomes the EOC manager until someone more qualified relieves you. So that may mean that if Debbie's the first one there, yeah, her normal role is a council liaison, but Debbie's also been cross-trained, as everyone else on this list has been cross-trained to be an EOC manager. So Debbie may have to assume that role because Mike's got to take care of family or do something else. And Mike may say, hey, I can't get there for 3 hours, which means Debbie will then have to figure out who her backup is in that council liaison role. It might be Rich. It might be a Stacey Ray. It might be someone else. And so I just want that, it's important context, because when we drill on these things, it's easy to drill when everything goes right. But the reality is rarely do emergencies go the way we want them to. And so I want to highlight the point that everyone that shows up to the EOC has an expectation that they may have to serve a different role than the role that they've specifically been trained in, and they may have to take over for a period of time. And in prolonged events, Mike can't work 5 days in a row. So at some point in time, someone else is going to have to come in and be the EOC manager. So I think it's important for that context that just for you to know that we train everybody in those roles, so everybody's ready if they need it to be.
Thanks, Jay. That's perfect. I'm going to tag on to that. An example in the fire department, we work in the incident command system every day. And that is one advantage of us having familiarity with that. So if two paramedics are sitting in a medic unit and they're driving down the road and they come across the fire, guess who's in charge? Just as Jay said, they're in charge until the battalion chief arrives, takes over the fire, and then assigns them to put on a hand line to go put out the fire. But that is exactly how the system works in a day-to-day operations for us. So it's built into it from day-to-day operations all the way to FEMA. So I'd like to spend just a minute or two discussing the city council and the mayor's role during an emergency. Duties of the council is to serve as a policy group to the EOC. The decisions that you make at city council have big impacts on the long-term effects of the city. Some policy decisions that you may be asked to do would be to declare an emergency. That could be something that could happen. Ensure the continuity of government by filling any needs of vacancies that may have happened. In the event that something terrible happened, there may be people that couldn't fill their duties as an elected or as department directors, and we may need to move forward and put new people in those spots. You may need to act to appropriate funds so that we can continue to move things forward. Or provide direction to the emergency management division. You may look at it from a policy direction and say, we really have needs here in the community. And then from there, with the city manager, it may direct some of the ideas and performance of the EOC. So that's just an overview. The other thing that you could be asked to do is enact special legislation to support disaster response and recovery. Some examples of legislation could be evacuation orders. We know that could be political, but we would look at this in a big way. You would probably coordinate with other jurisdictions and you would try to have some commonality between cities. You could also consider quarantine orders and discussion. We just went through a pandemic, but often we take our direction from the state health department. But again, that could be a role on guiding policy in your position as city council. Re-entry criteria, re-entry into a hazard zone. When is that deemed to be safe? And that would be something that would be, a city decision, but policy could ultimately be set by you through legislation. Regulation of goods. Sometimes in times of scarcity, we have to manage how things are allocated out, and that could be duty of yours as well. And conducting public hearings. Just at the very end of this, we may have to show why we did what we did, or answer questions, or share information to the public. So that's just the high level. Yeah, Councilmember Madrone.
Yeah, you mentioned one thing that we might be asked to do is declare an emergency. So does that have to happen for the EOC to be activated?
No, not necessarily. We could have an emergency where we bring up the EOC for a lot of reasons. But I think the idea of declaring an emergency is when you recognize that you're going to need help from beyond what we can get in the city.
Okay.
And so there's different reasons to declare emergencies. It could be so that you can work around laws or standards that normally would be in place, but due to the emergency, you need to have more flexibility to move quick and nimble. But also it can be to connect to the state that if they declared an emergency and then us declaring it, can open a pathway for money to flow. And then documentation equals reimbursement. So it's so important that we document really well once that happens.
And we have declared emergencies around homelessness and COVID and such. So it wasn't like an earthquake type of emergency, but we've taken that action before. Jim? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see.
Yeah. So just to kind of tease that out a little bit more, so we have a declared emergency around homelessness, but there's no EOC around that. So that they're separate
They are.
things. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, I think one of the main reasons we did the COVID emergency was so that we could make sure that the city manager had all the power possible in case we couldn't meet. So we declared an emergency and put the keys to the car in Jay's hand with signature for everything in that within the context of that emergency.
Thank you. Please.
Sorry, Mike, to keep jumping in here.
Yeah, this is
It's all my years at EOC coming back to haunt me. But I just, the Mike just listed off a number of policy choices and things that may come to council. And I just, those are going to be fed to you through the EOC, right? So we're going to be, as Mike mentioned, there's a lot of coordination that happens both at a statewide and a county level, and recommendations may come from a health department or others up to you. So you won't be someplace wondering, should we do this? Should we quarantine? Should we do that? You will get a list of, you will get recommendations that will come from the EOC manager up through the city manager to the council on some things. And as you have questions, you can also feed those questions back down through, for example, Debbie as your liaison into the EOC to get your questions answered. So I just wanted to make sure that you all knew there's a pathway for those decisions to come to you that will be thought out, just like a normal thing that we bring to you on a normal Tuesday night.
Just a normal Tuesday night. So this might be a question for our legal counsel. So say, I want to think about it, but say some of our council members are no longer with us after extreme. And do we just need to maintain 4? Where is he?
He's right here.
Oh. Sorry. Hi. And do we just need to maintain a quorum, or do we need to do an interview, an application? No, I think we would have to appoint somebody very quickly if we had. Yeah.
I was anticipating this question. No, you do not have to necessarily have a quorum. Traditionally, you think of 4 people. If it turns out that because of an emergency, council members either are severely injured, dead, or can't be located, you can operate with less than a quorum of those council members who can meet. And then you have options now for purposes of meeting, traditionally we think of in person. But if in the emergency, internet infrastructure was not basically demolished, you'd be able to conduct business by Zoom. And then OPMA requirements that relate to public participation. Because of the nature of the emergency, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can avoid that because of the emergency. So there's a number of things that they've done, particularly in recent amendments to OPMA, following the pandemic, that are actually helpful. But that's a key thing. So hopefully no one will be injured on council or killed in such a emergency event. But if it were to occur, you could have less than a quorum that could actually manage the policy decisions for the city.
So we don't have to do an emergency appointment to get people.
Thanks, Jim. Actually, I wanted to, sorry to keep drilling in on this. I just want to get clear. So, you were mentioning certain policy decisions that that could come as recommendations from the EOC. You mentioned evacuation, quarantine, regulation of goods, and all that. And separate from that, there's a potential declaration of emergency, which Jim was saying that, like, when we did that for COVID, we, gave the keys over to Jay to, so that we could act quickly. So if we declared an emergency, would that mean that some of these things that you've listed off would then go to the city manager for a decision? Like, what I'm just trying to figure out where this line is, and maybe it's not that clear. I don't know.
No, I think it's a good question. I'm around this. So COVID was obviously a very particular thing. We didn't need to stand up the EOC during COVID, but there was a recognition about the concerns about what would happen if several council members became incapacitated with COVID. So the emergency you passed there gave me, Mark used to tease me, I had ultimate authority on things. You gave me some very clear authority that I could make some decisions, and then a lot of times I made them, and then I circled back in the council meeting with a resolution so I could follow up with you about what decisions that were made. That's a very specific incident that could happen. The types of emergencies that I think Mike's talking about that might lend itself to an EOC, it could be a pandemic. If COVID had really progressed to a place where we had significant shutdowns of hospitals and we had trouble staffing our police department, fire department, and other things, that could have triggered an EOC activation. So you already had declared the emergency. That one's came beforehand. And we were going to monitor, and that could have led to an EOC activation. Thankfully, it did not. So every emergency is a little different in terms of how we manage it. And sometimes we get out front with an emergency declaration. Sometimes that emergency declaration comes after the EOC has come together and they've talked about it and said, you know what, this is getting to a point now. It seems like we need to make sure we're documenting and making sure we've got a good plan here. We need an emergency declaration. So I would just say that every situation is probably different in how we make those decisions.
And just one other additional thing I would add to Jay is that the governor, for his declarations, needs local declarations first in multiple places to be able to declare a state emergency. So in some places we might get asked to do that from above so that we can help the state with their process.
Great discussion. Thanks, everybody. So let me see kind of where I'm going to go from here. The process of declaring an emergency could be brought up by the city manager and then a resolution written. And then you as a body legislate that by passing it. And then from there, moving it forward. So then it could go a bunch of different ways at that point. It could be like homelessness, where it pretty much stays in the city of Olympia, or it could be something like the earthquake, where we fall under the state emergency declaration, and then ultimately we get federal funds from that. So I think if there's no more questions, I'll move forward to the next slide. Did I miss anything? I feel like I might be off a little bit on track. Let's see, maybe I'm good. Declaring an emergency, I just covered some of the process for that. So I did get a little ahead of myself. And I think a point that's worth discussing is, how does our EOC coordinate with other EOCs? And so if we're going to look kind of from the lower level and then raise up in the hierarchy, is a city of Lacey and Tumwater have EOCs as well as we do, the city of Olympia. Yelm, I think, has one as well, smaller, further to the south. Thurston County as an EOC, it's more robust than they have more resources, more people, and more funding to do more. So we often coordinate and collaborate with plans, development, and training with them. But when we bring up our EOC, one of the things we would do is we'd make a call to the county and let them know that. Another thing that they would do is we would let our surrounding cities know that that happened, and we could look across to Tumwater if they brought up theirs and how could we assist. So there's that level of peers, and then the oversight of Thurston County, which provides more resources. And above Thurston County is the Washington State Emergency Management, which is located right by Joint Lewis Base McCord at Camp Murray. And then above that is federal FEMA. One thing that we learned is if like FEMA declares an emergency for like COVID, the documentation requirements are much lighter. That federal money just starts coming and working its way into the city, and we end up getting it in different ways without us having to do a application and documentation to get that. So really large scales. The pipelines are larger and more direct. So we're at this point in the program that I just wanted to quickly just take a few minutes and take a quick look of where we're currently at as emergency management program so that you're aware. And then going forward, we'll go forward together. So I kind of formed this as a SWOT analysis, and it's open for discussion. If anybody has anything they would like to add to this, this is just the work that I've done. I see that the strengths of our program lie with the shoulders that we're standing on from the emergency managers before us. Chief Wright had the program for probably 15 years. He really elevated it during his time. And I think him putting Patrick Knopf in that position as a full-time EM coordinator took it to a new level. When you have somebody that's focusing on that every day and collaborating with other departments and other emergency management entities and organizations, I think we really got a lot of value out of that. I think as a result, Olympia's EM achieved state and federal compliance. We really did really well with that. And I would say historically, Olympia's EM has been a key partner in the regional emergency management, which is good. So I see those as strengths, and there may be others as well, but if anybody says any more, I'll just make a note of it. But when we're ready, we'll move over to the next item. I think some weaknesses that we can recognize is that in the last 18 months, we've had 2 new deputy chiefs, like similar to myself, the position that I'm in, with limited capacity and limited EM experience, because it really is a discipline. There's just there's vernacular, there's processes, there's grants, there's a lot there. So a little bit of getting up to speed with that. And it's been a great challenge, and I appreciate the challenge. But that's definitely a weakness if you've had a turnover in that staff. During this time, we focused on maintenance, minimum regional involvement, best to our ability, and the ability to keep our programs and plans in place so that we could receive federal money. We're doing that. Currently, we're unable to meet public educational requests, and we continue to rely on Patrick Knopf for his EM experience. Things come up, and he's one of the first guys I call, and he's so gracious. I'm just thankful he's still in the city because he's in the back pocket, and I buy him a lot of lunches, so it works out. I think we have some opportunities. We have a good foundation to build upon, which is an opportunity. I think we have an opportunity to fill an EM coordinator position with an emergency manager who knows that line of business really well.
Dante?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
On the last slide, I just wanted to clarify what you meant by public educational requests. Do you mean like how the state talks about like being 2 weeks ready and like that sort of thing?
Yeah, so say if a neighborhood association or a new large building has occupants and they said, hey, can you come out and do an emergency management preparedness? I don't have the bandwidth or the personnel to assign that. That's maybe has the materials to go forward with that. So there are some limited things that we do, but there's the demands much greater than the resources present. So we have some opportunities. If OFD becomes an RFA, this position will likely have to be reassigned from the fire department to potentially another city department. And again, I don't want to lead where this may go, but in some cities, public works could be your emergency manager. You look at the resources Public Works have. If you have somebody who is strong incident command background, that can be done, you know, in another department other than the fire department. Some cities utilize the fire chief, the police chief for that position. Sometimes, you know, it could just be an EM position that manages that from the executive level of the city. Could work directly under, as like communications does underneath the city manager. So there's a lot of ways to do that. And I don't have a suggestion or a recommendation. I don't think I have done the work to do that, but I just know that it's done different ways. Councilmember.
So with the role of an emergency manager, you know, you talked about public education opportunities. There's, you know, keeping the plan, making sure that we're ready in case an emergency happens and then there's an emergency. What else would they be doing in non-emergency times?
Well, I think the due to the work would be providing monthly meetings together for the Emergency Management Committee, keeping that training fresh and new and relevant, being involved in all those EM committees that I kind of gave a short list earlier. It's meetings every week on it. It would be reaching out to the public and strengthening citizens' resiliency after emergency by having them know what they need to do. I think social engagement would be another one through media, just leveraging that to be a program that's robust and reliable and present. You're welcome. So I think kind of looking at the SWOT analysis, the threats, if a disaster happens today, our our emergency management response will be challenged. But I'm also confident we have what we need to be successful. We have the right people. Jay said it really well. He has a long history in emergency management. Debbie Sullivan does, myself. I mean, there's many, Patrick Knopf, there's council members here who have been here long enough to have had training and been involved. So I think really we really are, we're okay. But I think we have to recognize that if you don't invest in this and we don't protect it, we may not be as strong as we are today. And I think we were stronger once before. So just recognizing that. We've had a lot of turnover regionally in emergency management. Thurston County Emergency Management, the manager has left. A new person came in and they left, and now we're getting a brand new person from Pierce County that's just now arriving. We described the turnover in our office in 18 months. That's happened. Tumwater, same thing. And Lacey's relatively new. So when you look as a region, those relationships aren't probably as strong as they once were, but it's an opportunity to develop those in the future, I think. So, Councilmember.
Do you have any thoughts around like the reason for the significant turnover? Were people burnt out with COVID, or is this something happening in this field across the nation, or is it just happenstance?
I don't think you can underestimate the effects of COVID. I think that it affected a lot, and I think emergency management had to touch that a lot. We brought up, ours in a partial activation for months, where Patrick constantly, evaluated, developed a report, presented out, and I'm sure that wore on him. But I think he found an opportunity at Public Works for professional growth, and I don't think that's necessarily his story. The EM manager at Thurston County had a long career, reached 30 something years, and was time to retire. And then Tumwater Fire Department, same thing. It's just their fire chief left, and this is kind of how it goes. So I don't have anything to point to that other than maybe it's cyclical. And I think it's just time to recognize that we could build more relationships there.
I'm assuming you're saying turnover also has to do with both jurisdictions on either side of us looking for new city managers.
We are at the last point where I just ask if you have any questions or comments that we could continue the discussion.
Again?
Oh, it's fine. At some point, it just turns into piling on. I am extremely impressed with your presentation tonight. It's just I think you did well to cover a lot of the points, and you talk about emergencies in such a beautiful way.
You're so kind. I always notice that in every council meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, your hair's not on fire when you're talking about it. City manager. Jay
Yeah,
Brennan.
one more thing I want to add for this conversation is in an emergency, our city policy says that all employees must report. So we always want people to take care of themselves and their families first. We don't want people trying to report in an unsafe manner, right? If you can't get here, you can't get here, but you have to communicate with your immediate supervisor, let them know where you are, and that you're either are or are not able to report. And when you report, depending on the nature of the emergency and what the needs of the EOC are, you may get asked to do a number of things. We can all be out filling sandbags. We could all, we could be directing traffic. In fact, in the earthquake of 2001, that's exactly what I did. I was out at an intersection directing traffic away from a very dangerous place, and I was out there for 6 hours doing that. So everybody has you may be asked to do something that's you've never done before, because if we're shorthanded somewhere, we got to fill in the best we can with what we have. So that's another really important context, is that in the toughest of times, I say this a lot, we show up as government employees. That's our job, is to be here in the toughest of times. And our employees, day in and day out, when we've had emergencies, they find a way to get here and report and help and do everything they can. So I just wanted to make sure you all knew that about that policy and how that all works when it comes together.
Okay.
Well, Jay, it was kind of like you were reading my mind, because my question was actually touching that about staff and reporting. And now that we have teleworking, what does that look like? How is the staff being accounted for in times of emergencies? If some folks are here in the building, but other folks are away or at home or what have you. And how does remote working really, how have we considered that and factored that into this plan?
Yeah, and we haven't drilled on that particular thing yet. It's something that we need to talk about. But the policy says that we all have a duty to report. And so what that means is, whether you're teleworking or not, when an emergency is declared, and we all know when it happens, that those employees need to check in with their immediate supervisor. And then those supervisors will be checking up through department directors and through the EOC about what the needs are. If we don't need them to come in to do something, we're not going to ask them to come into City Hall just to sit around, right? It may be that there's work that they can do, whether it's helping the finance team process invoices or something else that they can do from home. But in a case that, even if you're a teleworker, if you're able-bodied, and there's a task that needs doing, you may be asked to come in and assist with that task, no matter what it is. And so that won't change whether you're a teleworker or not a teleworker. But the interesting piece is that I think as we look to the future and hire an emergency manager, I think there's a lot more conversation about how we drill around those scenarios, because it's different post-COVID than it was beforehand. So I think there's some more conversation. And then one other thing that's just top of mind is, as Mike was talking about managing day to day, is within Public Works, for example, they have their own emergency management structure. So even though the EOC might not activate, it doesn't mean that the Public Works hasn't activated their emergency operations. That happens quite often. And then they monitor things like flooding on a lower level. It only gets to EOC if Public Works operations says we're overloaded, we're running out of supplies, we can't find them, we need help. That's when EOC would activate. Similar in, as you've seen when there's a significant fire has their own command structure to deal with that. When there's a large scale police event, they have their own structure to deal with those larger events that aren't the one-offs but are significant. And so everything kind of gets to a place, and the decision point around EOC is really around, can we not staff? Can we not get supplies? Can we not find stuff? Are they too overworked? Is it multiple days of events? That's when we start to get to this next phase.
There's also got to be I just lost the word. A reason, like, say it's maybe we're not as overwhelmed as people in our community are overwhelmed.
Yes.
So that's also a reason to stand this up, I would think. Like in an earthquake, it's like if people are out there stranded and upset. And I had a question around cell service interruptions. It's like, oh, you're going to check in with your supervisor. What if the cell towers are down, or there's a cyber crime kind of thing going on? Russia.
The communications is always could be a fragile piece of this, a fragile element after an emergency. But I think all we can do is the best that we can do. People know that once they take care of their family, if they're unable to make contact, ultimately they're going to have to come into work to see how they can help after those basic needs have been met. That's really the best that we'll do. If things get really bad, we may be using paper and pen, doing the best that we could, like we would in 1960. Radios will still work. If you do a VHF, it's radio to radio. So you'll have that in the field. But yeah, it could be as bad as we can imagine, or we may be comfortable like we are now.
So the younger generations will have to practice paper.
We could make a drill out of it.
Jim?
That's when Mike brings out the rotary dials.
We have them.
I'm sure.
We have red phones that are analog that you push a button. So when all things go wrong, yes, we do.
We used to have one in the council office. I don't know if it's still up there. Anyway, so 2 comments. First of all, I want to say I've often thought that if staff members were to learn how to make a presentation to the city council, you should be the one to teach them. I've thought that before, and I've reminded when my colleague made the comment about your presentation style. So thank you for that. This planning work is really, really important. And to me, just the 2 bodies of plans would warrant putting out the job announcement for the emergency manager immediately. Like, I don't understand why we would want to get any more behind than we are today, even with the RFA context. So I'm just going to say that out loud. And then the second piece for me is just something for us all to pay attention to. It at work. I recently joined a national disaster resiliency support planning process. And one of the things that's really fascinating is, you know, with all of the equity work that we've been doing at the city, is when we start looking at disaster, we find the inequities that we're talking about around race and income and gender, they are exacerbated in a disaster at a much higher magnitude of scale than it might happen for people that are not underserved populations, for lack of a better word. And so I think it's really important that as we move forward in this work, we find a way to bring that voice to light, because one of the things that's been really clear to me, especially in wildfire planning, is that the government messaging for disaster preparedness does not get through to households of color. And they're not ready, they're not prepared, and their county governments up and down the West Coast are saying, we taught them 3 days, 3 ways at their neighborhood association, they're ready. And they weren't, and they aren't. And not that it's just people of color, but a lot of people, the messaging is not getting through and they're not ready. And so I know that's more of a county conversation around planning, but something that I wanted to bring up here today.
And we found that in COVID.
There's one element to the CMP that's called the whole community, and the idea that you work with leaders of maybe faith or community of different to find out what the needs are, and then work with that group to get funnel logistics or needs to that group. So that is an element that's in the plan, but definitely needs to work and build the relationships ahead of time. But it is considered, and I just wanted to bring that at a high level.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, something that's in the solid waste advisory plan that's coming to council next week, I think, is the concept about not just translation of materials, but transcreation. So this would be hazard mitigation before something bad happens, but working with different communities to figure out how does their culture, receive information, what, and so doing some of that upfront work so that when a disaster hits, like these materials have been created together, and those, like you said, the relationships are there, but so is the protocol to make sure that information is getting to where it needs to go. But I did have another, just a comment, maybe a question. On an earlier slide, you mentioned the BRIC funding. I don't remember what that stands for, but I think the R stands for resilience, because we like to use that word. And it took me a second to think about like why that was familiar. And it's because it just was recently talked about in a sea level rise meeting. And it made me think, we might have multiple departments who are working on hazard mitigation type stuff, eyeing the same types of federal funding. So how do those decisions get made in terms of, what we're going to apply for different types of hazard mitigation, knowing that we've got many things to work on?
Well, generally, they all find their way to me. At some point in time, I rely on department directors as we put together those lists to help me prioritize. So we do have conversations so that we're not all out there. We coordinate a lot about what grants we're going after as departments and what we're seeking. And that's how we do that. We coordinate amongst each other, either an executive team with my department directors or their one-on-ones with me about what their interests are. And then we jointly figure out what we think the highest priority is. Sometimes that comes up and may come up in my one-on-ones with you at times about in terms of if we're kind of on the fence about what's the higher priority for the community at the moment. So that those conversations can happen that way too, as part of helping us make decisions. But generally that's kind of how we do it.
Well, just a side comment, wasn't there a video about how you guys do the budget and it's like the Hunger Games and you guys all have to fight over that? Okay. I'm actually thinking about my own training and we do drills on CPR and crises and we put the team through it so that when it really happens, it's like muscle memory. I don't know, this is a crazy idea. But I've been through the pandemic on council, but is there any way to do a quick exercise at some point in the future where council relationship to an EOC so that, you know, we know it's there. Hey, we've been through it instead of going, where the hell did I put this book? Oh, it's under the wall that was just crushed down because of the earthquake. But I don't know, it's just a crazy idea.
Yeah, we can do our own little tabletop sometime.
Yeah.
I had something to follow up on what Jim was talking about as far as reaching under-resourced households that might not be engaged in this type of discussion. And is there, there's discussion about a landlord registry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that might be another pathway to get to renters is like by educating landlords. And that can also be a service that we can provide to their tenants once we have a full-time emergency management position filled.
Mm-hmm.
I strongly support what you're saying, Jim, because that Greg Wright, that was pretty much what he felt like that was like his lane.
Mm-hmm.
And he came to council numerous times a year and talked to us on camera, to get to the community about being prepared. And then there's a toolkit. I know our neighborhood did it. Where you get to know all your neighbors and you find out what strengths there are and who has what and who's going to be the asset mapping and who's going to be that house that everyone goes to. But in a rental situation, who's going to do that? So I think property management companies are also a pathway to get to renters. I'm just spitballing some ideas, but we don't have the bandwidth to do that, like you said right now. So that is an opportunity and kind of a threat. Anybody else? Dante.
Yeah, I just have one last question about, I don't know if anybody knows of any higher educational efforts to sort of boost the emergency management field. We live in a region where it would totally make sense for us to have these programs here at our disposal. So anything like that at all? Where do people get their education?
I just can say that in the online world, there are emergency management master's degrees. I considered that when I was looking for my program, but I don't know of anything that's local, but it's a good question.
I think we're good. Thank you so much. Like everyone has been mentioning, this is a very, very important part of our job that we don't think about, very often because it's kind of not easy or fun to think about, but it's super, super important. And our roles are important, even though it seems somewhat limited here. Sometimes it's just like during COVID, it's just being that face in the community that's like, we got this, we're going to be fine. That, just kind of the diplomats and the cheerleaders, for lack of a better word, for our community during crises like this. And so I want to thank you again. And hopefully we can make this maybe every other year, have a briefing. I think it'd be really good. So I think we're all right. All right. So with the end of our study session being now, I'm going to adjourn.